því að bjóða ykkur velkomin hingað í Þjóðminjasafn Íslands og ánægjulegt að sjá hvað margir hafa gefið sér tíma til að vera hérna með okkur í dag þegar sólin skín úti. Við erum hér með Málþing Bláklæddu konuna, nýjar rannsóknir sem hafa verið framkvæmdir á fornum kumli. Og hér í dag verða 4 erindi. Fyrirkomulagið er þannig að ég tek kannski örfá spurningar eftir hvert erindi en ef okkur gefst tími í lokin þá höfum við nánari umræðu þá. En í miðjunni verður gert kaffihlé og þá munum við bjóða upp á hressingu hérna uppi hjá sýningunni. Welcome to those of you that are not Icelandic speaking. We're going to be hearing 4 presentations here today. One of them is going to be in Icelandic and the other 3 are going to be in English. So bear with us for the Icelandic one. Ég ætla þá að byrja því að kynna Steinunn Kristjánsdóttir, fornleifafræðing, prófessor í fornleifafræði við Háskóla Íslands og Þjóðminjasafn Íslands. Og hún ætlar svona að gefa okkur næst bakgrunn þetta kuml. Og hún hefur mjög umfangsmikla reynslu að stjórna fornleifarannsóknum hér á landi og býti velkomin Steinunn, gjörðu svo vel.
Tíma hérna á svo fallega sólardegi og hlusta. En eins og hún sagði þá ætla ég að fjalla aðeins gefa svona yfirlit yfir þetta kuml sem fannst þarna á litlu Ketilsstaðum á Héraði landnámskonuna þar. Og ég ætla líka svona setja svona kumlið aðeins í svona samfélagslegt og menningilegt samhengi. En kannski byrja bara svona örstutt að segja fyrir því að kuml eru, þetta sem kuml og kuml eru þá grafir úr heiðnum sið og yfirleitt þetta verður frá tímabilinu frá landnámi til Kristjánstöku og það var Kristján sem innleiddi þetta orð og þetta verður alveg fest í sessi. Og þetta er svona kannski til þess að greina svona grafir frá dysjum og kristnum gröfum. En dysjar eru sem sagt bara grafir utan kirkjugarðs frá öllum tímum. En já, það er alltaf merkilegt þegar kuml finnst á Íslandi og líka þegar þau finnast innan annarra landsvæða en bara hér á Íslandi heldur alls staðar þar sem að víkingar höfðu aðsetur. Og hérna á Íslandi hafa bara 330 held ég veit ekki alveg töluna á þeim núna en það stendur yfir, markvissleit af kumlum, rannsókn á þeim, stendur yfir á landinu, Norðurlandi. Þannig að talan er svo sem að breytast alltaf. En já, þetta er sem sagt staðurinn cirka þar sem að kumlið fannst 1938 við vegagerð og það er nú eiginlega þannig að flest kuml sem að fundist á Íslandi finnast einmitt við hvers kyns framkvæmdir, byggingar, þegar að vera að byggja eða þegar að vera að leggja vegi og eins líka það kemur oft fyrir að þau blása upp en það er mjög erfitt að finna þau á yfirborðinu því þau láta lítið yfir sig og það sé nú oft mikið síðan undir sverðinum. Og þarna, það, já, ég ætla líka að skýna svona örlitla mynda þessu svona af héraðinu cirka hvað þetta er mynd af Egilsstöðum og svo hvað þetta lagafljótið þarna. Og þetta er semst á héraði. En Matthías Þórðarsson var sem það kallaði staðinn þegar kumlið fannst og ég þarna á eins og í 1938, hann var þjóðminjavörður þá, að hann bjargaði svona því sem hægt var að bjarga þarna og vegna þess að humli skemmtist aðeins þegar að vegurinn var lagður, en til dæmis þá setti hann þennan vanga holdi sem hafði varðveist í gröfinni í formalín til dæmis, en það verður sagt frá því nánar hér á eftir, þarna forvörðurinn hér. En ég ætla að segja ykkur aðeins hvað fannst í þessu kumli, en eins og ég sagði áðan þá þegar ég setja þessu svona samfélagslegt og menningarlegt samhengi og kannski við ykkur að taka aðeins þátt í því að ég ætla að spyrja ákveðna spurninga og þið getið velt þeim fyrir ykkur bæði hér og í kaffitímanum eða bara inn á eftir. En ég ætla að spyrja svona, rauður þráðurinn verður hjá mér þetta svona hver þessi kona var, að þið spyrjuð ykkur þeirra setningar eða spurningar. Og ég ætla einmitt að spyrja bara, var hún víkingur, bóndi, húsfreyja, ambátt, frilla eða eitthvað annað? Og áður en ég segi ykkur aðeins meira svona frá þessu samhengi þarna á víkingaöld og ég held að hún sé örugglega landnámskona því hún flytur eitthvað mjög snemma og það margir sem að flytja eitthvað allt landnámstímabilið en hún gæti verið eitthvað af þessu. Hún fellur vissulega undir hóp þessa fólks sem bjó í Norður-Evrópu á víkingaöld og það eru mikill hluti þeirra eða áttalega þá sem víkinga. Hún gæti hafa sett stað hér sem bóndi eða verið húsfreyja. Þá getur hún náttúrulega líka hafa verið keypt og verið træll eða ambátt en það er þekkt að víkingarnir gerðu það og það er vitað að hún fæddist á syðurhluta Bretlandseyja og flutti hingað til lands 5-10 ára gömul og Jón mun tala þetta meira hérna á eftir en dó mjög ung og það er ekki ennþá vitað genetískan uppruna hennar, það er ekki búið að greina DNA en það er verið að vinna í því. Síðan aftur gripinn í gröfinni og svo vefnaði fötin hennar sína svona blöndu af norrænum og keltneskum spunahefðum og það er Michèle sem allir að tala það líka þetta eftir. En síðan einmitt þetta var hún frilla eða sem að gæti verið vegna þess að hjúskaparhættir voru nú talsvert öðruvísi á víkingaöld heldur en þegar við urðu á kristnum tíma og það var eitt af hlutverkum eða með kristnum lögum og kristnum tökunum þá var verið að innleiða lög kaþólsku kirkjunnar sem að boðaði einkvæni og skírlífi presta en áður var svona eins konar einhvers slags form af fjölkvæni tíðkað og mér datt nú bara í hug Laxdælarsaga þó að sem að svo sem enginn veit hvort það er sönn en hún endurspeglar svona ákveðið viðhorf í samfélaginu á þessum tíma en það sem fjallaði hana Melkorku sem var dóttir Miðkjartans Írakonungs, þetta þekkið þið örugglega mörg og víkingarnir rændu henni og hún var til sölu á mörkuðum í Danmörku og það sem Höskuldur Dala Kollsson hitlaðist af henni, þessari fallegu stúlku, Melkorku og hann keypti hana og hélt sem frillu lengi vel og eignaðist með henni son en hann átti náttúrulega líka eiginkonu. En þá ætla ég líka aðeins að skoða þetta betur að það sem að ég kannski vil undirstrika líka það er nú ekki búið að velta fyrir sig hvort þetta séu víkingar eða bændur hérna á Íslandi og oft er að tala þetta hann bara verið bændur og engir víkingar og ég held nú reyndar að það sé erfitt að skoða þennan samfélagshóp hérna á Íslandi án þess að skoða það í stærra samhengi. Þessi hópar, þetta fólk sem setti þér á landnámsöld var hluti af stærri heild og hugsanlega svona flóknari samsetning af þessum þjóðfélagshópi heldur en kannski oft talið þó svo að víkingarnir hafi hugsanlega og væntanlega deilt svona sömu siðum og þá er ég að tala grafsiði og annað og aðrir svona germennskir þjóðfélagshópar í Norður-Evrópu gerðu á járnöld, þó svo kannski að víkingarnir sem eru nú mjög svo bendlaðir við dráps- og ránsferðir og baráttu gegn kristninni á víkingöld. En eins og ég sagði áðan að það líka þetta hjúskaparform þeirra var annað heldur en þessar kristinna þjóðfélaga og barátta kristninnar var einmitt líka sneri svolítið þetta. Og það hafa verið gefnar út mjög margar bækur víkingana og það kom nú einn bara út núna í vor, The Viking World, sem heitir Einarsagt. En það eru ansi margir sem að hafa þessu áhuga, en það er þetta áhugastöfni og endalaust verið að ræða þetta hverjir þeir voru og hvernig hópu. Og Neil Price, fornleifafræðingur í Skotlandi, hann færir fyrir því rök einmitt í grein þarna að konur hafi líka verið víkingar eða þær hafi sem tekið þátt í þessum ránsferðum eins og karlarnir og þess vegna segir þarna þetta var semst hópur kvenna og karla sem fór ránsferði nánast allar Norður-Evrópu og líka út fyrir hana og þarna nú kortin sýnir svona þessi svæði sem að víkingarnir ferðu höfðu vikna við í ránsferðum eða öðrum. Og þeir sem sagt, þetta var meira hlutin í skandinavarsamt, svona erfðafræðilega en líka fólk á öðrum uppruna. Og þeir sem sagt eins og ég sagði áðan rændu og rifliðu og líka konum og sem þeir heiti hjónabönd eða þrældóm og það er líka karlar og börn skæð. Og aðeins þá að þessum hlutföllum og þetta með konur, hvort að þær hafi verið víkingar eða ekki og hvernig hver samsetningin á þessum kumlum sem að fundist hérna á Íslandi og innan svona þessara staða sem að þeir fóru til hérna í Norður-Evrópu að eins og þið sjáum það er þetta nú ótrúlega fá kuml svona miðað við fólksfjöld og hann talaði kannski 30.000 eða eitthvað hann cirka það er nú svo sem 30-50 kannski þúsund að búið hérna á Víkingöld og það er 330 fundin. Það getur verið að þessi 27.000 séu einhvers staðar þarna sem það hafa fundist en þarna er hlutfallið konur eru áberandi færri og svo börn skulu finnast sjaldan. Ég held að ég er ekki alveg viss með tölunum þegar bara 1 eða 2 eða 3 hérna á Íslandi. Og hlutfallið er hvað athyglisverðast í Mið- og Suður-Noregi þar sem hafa fundist 1500 kuml og það er 80% karlakuml en 20% kvenkuml. Og þarna í Danmörku er þetta svipað svo sem á Íslandi og þarna en í bæði og Birka og Svíþjóð, Birka og Hetebyggi er þetta svona engar víkingagrafir og fundist á Grænlandi, mjög veit ég allavega, en það kom norrænu með 1000. Þannig að þið sjáið að þetta er svona svolítið, hlutfallið, það hallar þarna á konum, en þarna, og eins og ég er nú ekki með tölur baskum hérna, en þau eru eins og ég segi mjög fá sem hafa fundist. Nú gripirnir, að þeir eru yfirleitt svona varningur frá jafn nálægum sem fjarlægum löndum, að þetta eru vopn og skart sérstaklega, en í sumum kumlum finnast bara mjög fáir gripir en með vopnin og skartinu er oft gripir til heimilisnota og svona daglegs brúks, en síðan er aftur einhvers slags faratæki, gjarna með bátar eða kerrur eða hestar og hestar hafa fundist í nokkuð mörgum kumlum hérna á Íslandi til dæmis og þannig að þetta er svona kannski þessi mynd sem ég vildi gefa ykkur áður en ég fer aðeins að sjá tímanlínu. Þarna í þessa þetta kuml sem fannst þarna á Ketilsstöðum og þessa konu sem þarna fannst að eins og ég sagði, mér langar að velta það fyrir mér hvernig getum við skilgreint hana, hver var hún og hvað já, svona sjálfsmynd hennar eins og maður myndi segja kannski í græðunum, en hún sest að hérna landinu og sögð og ég var að velta þessu fyrir mig innbyrjun. En þetta svona frekar hefðbundin gröf, myndi ég segja, ef það hægt að tala hefðbundna grafir frá víkingatímabilinu. Þetta eru svona hversdagslegar eigur, klæðnaður, skart og mjög hefðbundi svona skart sem eins og konur áttu gjarnan og svo áhöld fyrir svona daglegra nota. Sumt gós eða varningur frá fjöllegum löndum eins og perlurnar og svo liturinn í klæðunum þó ullin hafi sennilega verið íslensk eins og Michèle mun segja þetta hérna eftir. Hún var svona lögð á hliðina, þannig að þetta er svo sem ekkert alveg vitað hvernig þetta var allt þarna vegna þess að Google fannst við að gera eins og ég sagði áðan en hún var sennilega lögð þarna á hlið og eins og fram hefur hún komið ítrekað áður og þá lá langi hennar við aðra brjóstnæluna, stóru sem sagt og þess vegna varðveiktist hann en hann var gert í hliðnum síð og þetta sem breytist með kristnitökunni. Þannig að það þetta ekki nokkuð og svo líka búið að aldursgreina konungsaldursgreiningum og fleiri aðferðum náttúrulega út frá breikunum og öðru frá hvaða tímum þannig að það engin vafi á því að hún verður frá landnámsöld á Íslandi og með nýjastu greiningana þá var hún fædd 1915 og dó ung 17 eða 22 ára gömul og hún sem sagt bjó fyrstu árin á Bretlandseyjum og flutti síðan í Ísland 5 eða 10 ára og síðan eru þessi fallegi gripir sem að fundust í gröfinni. Þetta eru brjóstnælur þar sem eru svona dæmigerðar fyrir skart víkingakvenna, þannig sem finnst ekki öllum gröfum en samt frekar algengt og þetta eru innfluttir gripir. Síðan það aftur þríblaðanælan með svona smára blaðaskreytingu sem hún þetta talin vera frakkverskum uppruna en nælan sjálf skandinavískri gerð sem hefur þó verið þróuð á víkingöld og þetta innfluttur gripur líka á bronsi. Síðan það perlurnar að í gröfinni fundust allavega 42 perlur en mikið af perlubrotum og þær eru héðan og þaðan og af Evrópu og þessi rauða þarna úr rafi sem sennilega frá Danmörku og hinnar eru héðan og þaðan eins og ég sagði og það eru margar frá Suður-Evrópu. Síðan var hann þarna með í gröfinni var sem sagt snældusnúður, hann 4 cm í þvermál, mjög svona hefðbundinn, hann í flerbelgi og sem sagt innfluttur eða allavega efnið í hann flutt til landsins af því það finnst ekki í íslenskri náttúru og kannski allt í lagi að nefna það að snældusnúðar voru ótrúlega merkileg tæki þá hefði ekki látið mikið yfir sér og það má segja svona að afkoma Íslandinga hafi næstu byggst á snældusnúðum vegna þess að allt vaðmál var unnið með snældusnúðum og rokkarnir til dæmis og önnur tæki komu ekki til söguna fyrir mjög seint og bara eru bara, frekar nýlegir myndi maður segja en allavega útflettingur og allt þetta sem afkoma Íslandinga byggði á miðöldum að þetta var allt unnið með snældum og snældusnúðum og halastefnum og eins og segi það svona mikilvægt tæki. Síðan fannst finnst beinopgar það sem sagt og leifar af járni og það var haldið fyrst þetta væri af kambi en síðan hefur það komið í ljós að sennilega þetta hnífur og sem sagt svona slíður utan af hnífi og þetta kom bara fram í forvörslu. Annað sem kom í ljós líka að það eru talað verið 2 brýni í gröfinni og það var athugað með annað brýnið og það kom í ljós að þetta er svona póstir sem var notað til að meta góðmálma og þannig að hún kannski eitthvað verið í einhverjum viðskiptum en það sem komið fram leifar af silfri og blýi á honum en engar járnleifar en þetta líka innfluttir gripir og flögubörnir. Þá síðast En ekki síst kannski, það var þarna líka mjög fallegur steinn, glerhallur. Hann finnst í íslensku náttúru, sem lág svona steinn og kannski var verndargripur. Það hafa fundið svona steinar einhverjum svona tegundum eins og glerhallur og fleiri í kunnum, bæði hér á Íslandi og utan Íslands, sem eru túlkaðir sem svona verndargripir og verðast hafa verið lagðir af einhverju ástæðu í grafirnar. En ég ætla þá bara að enda þetta með þessari spurningu minni. Hvað haldið þið? Þetta er sem sagt kona sem flutti hingað til lands. Spurning hvort hún kom hingað sjálf vilju með fjölskyldu sinni, eða ættmennum eða vinum, 5 eða 10 ára gömul, eða hvort að frá Bretlandseyjum, eða hvort að hún sé eitt af þessum börnum sem voru seld eða kona sem var seld eða gefin í hjónaband, eitthvað það gift hana. Það voru mjög ungar konurnar sem voru gefnar í hjónabanda á Víkingöld, kannski 12-14 ára, og þarna eða var þetta bara húsfreyjan á litlu Ketilsstaðum sem dó svona ung. En ég ætla bara að enda ykkur með þessa opnu spurningu Lísa þessu dag til. Takk fyrir.
Já, takk fyrir þetta Steinunn. Það er tíma fyrir að fá spurningar. Þegar við fyrir að varðið. Þessu?
Já, takk fyrir. Ég var að velta fyrir mér með þetta kuml. Ég finnst greint fyrir að það getur að hafa raskastrótið í vegavinnslu, en var hægt að sjá hvernig mununum var komið fyrir í gröfinni að einhverju leyti eða?
Já, það var einhverju leyti hægt, en þetta hafði samt raskast, en allavega nælan var hér við vangan, sem bendir til þess að hún hafi bara verið klætt í föt og bara með skartið eins og það venjulega á víkingaallfararkonum. Svo hefur verið giskað á því að fundist líka svona viðarleif og ýmislegt annað þarna, naglar og eitthvað. Það hafi kannski verið kistill með þessu dóti sem var líka þarna, en það, já, annars hafði þetta raskast.
Já, þannig að það hefur ekki verið hægt að sjá hvar muninn gæti hafa verið.
Nema þetta nælan og það er mjög svo hefðbundið að ég held að ég alveg geta sér, já.
Kannski bara bætt við, en það var samt vitað og hann tekur það fram að þeir voru allir á sama stað.
Já.
Þannig að þeir lágu eftir hann úrst að nála fjöðunum, þannig að það kannski stiður líka að þeir hafi mögulega verið settir í einhvers konar kistu.
Þessi þínir aðrir en skartið. Þannig nælurnar eru venjulega, það er svona nælur og svo ferlirna á milli. Þannig að það má gera það fyrir að það hafi verið þannig, fyrst að nælan var alltaf. En
Fleiri spurningar? Ég held að við geymum nú frekar spurningar samkvæmt fyrir í restina þegar við erum að fá að heyra hitt sem býður okkur í næstu erindum. Takk hérlega fyrir þetta, Steinunn. I think we'll switch to English now as the program is shifting to English. I would like to present Walser III. He is a biological anthropologist carrying out PhD research at the University of Iceland in collaboration with Durham University, National Museum of Iceland and Decode Genetics. He specializes in human osteology and paleopathology. He's going to explain a little bit more about what findings he's been able to discover from the bones. Joe, welcome.
Hi everyone. In this presentation I will discuss the osteological analysis, the results of the isotopic analysis, AMS dating, and the ongoing ancient DNA research. The above images are artist reconstruction of the Ketilsstaðir burial and were formed after Matthías Þórðar's original descriptions provided after the excavation in 1938. Normally a mixture of dental age estimation methods and skeletal age estimation are used to determine an individual's age at death. This mixture of approaches is important because the rate of skeletal changes in an individual can be variable depending on the person's health or environment, lifestyle, and other genetic factors, while development of the teeth tends to be much more consistent with chronological age. While no radiographs were taken for this research, the teeth and the apices of the permanent molars could be seen clearly in the maxillary alveolar bone, and were fully complete in an occlusion. The third molar normally begins to erupt after the age of 16 and generally is complete in formation and in occlusion by the age of 24. In the original report by Matthías, he identified that the individual clearly died young based on examining her teeth. In this way, dental attrition or wear methods can be used to provide an age estimation, but a lot of factors tend to complicate this type of methodology and cannot necessarily be used on populations outside of the populations that the methods are based upon. These types of methods have demonstrated a margin of error of up to 10 years from the estimated range, and the consumption of fermented foods and drinks may have also contributed to acidic erosion in the teeth, as has been identified by a number of other Icelandic osteological studies. Nonetheless, it is clear that the individual was a young adult at the time of death, and that the dental wear seen in individuals suggests an age range of 17 to 25, as there is minimal to no exposure of the dentine in the permanent molars. The standard methods of skeletal age estimation include epiphyseal fusion and age-related bone changes, and normally provide a 5 or 10 year, sometimes 9-year age range for age at death. Due to the preservation and incompleteness of the skeleton, skeletal age estimates cannot be derived. The photo in the top right is a fragment of a clavicle with preserved soft tissue clinging to the periosteal surface as a result of the copper ions leaching from the copper alloy objects, similar to the preservation seen in the facial remains, which Julia will discuss later. While the individual's facial tissues were likely preserved due to very close contact with the birches, copper corrosion products can move through a grave over time due to taphonomic processes involving the movement of water and soil leaching, for example. The green staining can be seen throughout the skeleton, including on the lower body, possibly due to a mixture of these factors. The oscoxa pictured here shows where the auricular surface is located, an important skeletal aging element, but due to the postmortem damage it couldn't be evaluated. On the left, the individual's thigh bone, the femur, can be seen in 2 photographs. The femoral head and neck were used in metrical sex estimation and to infer that the individual was small in height and weight. The last image of the femoral shaft has been included only to show the general postmortem damage seen in the skeleton. Sex estimation in skeletal remains is primarily based on sexually dimorphic morphology throughout the body that tend to correlate with biological sex. It is problematic to determine biological sex based on one morphological trait alone. Some women are robust and some men are gracile. These traits are differently expressed across populations, and therefore using a combination of traits seen throughout the skeleton is normally standard. The original reports by Matthías identified the individual as female based upon the grave goods, as oval brooches had been called characteristic of female attire at this time, and described that finding female graves of this kind was not as common in comparison to male graves. While irrelevant in this case, there are inherent problems with inferring biological sex from gendered grave goods. The socially gendered belongings an individual may be buried with do not always correlate with biological sex, but rather with collective and personal identities. The osteological sex estimation for the woman from Ketilsstaðir was based upon the morphology of the mandible, orbital rims, glabella, brow ridge, forehead slope, temporal line, acetabulum, and standard measurements of the femoral head. Paleopathological research must always consider the osteological paradox, which defines a number of biases that must be considered when interpreting the findings. For an example, skeletal changes normally occur due to chronic or long-standing infections and will not necessarily appear during short periods of illness. As a result, it is sometimes the individuals with the most bone changes that survive with illness the longest, as the individuals with severe and fast-acting diseases may not have survived long enough for bone changes to manifest. As a result, we cannot say that the individual from Ketilsstaðir was healthy, but she did not show significant evidence for chronic disease or pathological conditions that result in bone change. Some of the teeth of the woman from Ketilsstaðir show faint traces of linear enamel defects called dental enamel hypoplasia, which occurs due to illness or nutritional stress during the development and coalescence of the dental enamel. It indicates that she may have suffered a short period of malnutrition in childhood, which is later corroborated by the isotopic analysis performed on the teeth pictured above. During this research, the decision to only take one sample for ancient DNA analysis and one tooth sample for isotopic analysis was made in order to preserve as much of her remains as possible. Although we may have gained more information or more accurate information from destroying more material, the ethical repercussions outweighed the benefits in this case. Finding these materials for scientific analysis was a chance find, as the majority of the teeth are in the wet specimen. Because the remains contained in the jar are contaminated with copper, a formalin solution, and other materials, molecular and chemical research on these remains may not have provided any results. New methods are being developed to control for these contaminants, and the possibility to extract information from the wet specimen may be possible in the future. More importantly, because we did not destroy the remaining dry tooth, a sample with good integrity is preserved for the future when methods have been improved. This is a quickly evolving discipline which wasn't possible years ago and will likely be revolutionized in the next decade. Carbon and nitrogen isotope composition are used to reconstruct diet, while strontium, oxygen, and lead isotopes in teeth and bone can sometimes be used to reconstruct geographic origin, migration in human populations, and cultural affinity. Isotopic analyses are conducted by assessing isotopic signatures derived from the enamel and the extracted organic components of tooth and bone called collagen under high-resolution mass spectrometry. The signatures are compared with published data and with previously completed isotopic studies to map the signatures to water sources and geology in particular regions, for example. I will now present a summary of the results of the isotopic analyses as provided by Janet Montgomery and Tina Jacob at Durham University and Julia Beaumont at Bradford University. A right second maxillary incisor was subject to high-resolution carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of dentine collagen to investigate diet and dietary change during childhood over the period of tooth formation, which occurs from 6 months to 10.5 years of age. The figure above shows that between the ages of 6 months and 5 years, her dietary protein came from predominantly terrestrial sources, demonstrated by the blue line, staying within the green zone. This data is supported by the carbon isotope ratio obtained from her tooth enamel carbonate, which represents whole diet, which is also indicative of a wholly or largely terrestrial diet in the first few years of life. After the age of 5, her carbon isotope ratio began to rise, signaling a change in diet, indicative of the consumption of an increasing amount of marine protein. This could have occurred because older children ate more marine foods such as sea fish, seabirds, or marine mammal meat, or that a change in residence or food availability enforced the observed change. The nitrogen isotope profile also shows an overall increase, which would be expected with increasing consumption of marine protein from the age of 6 months to 10.5 years. However, the initial sharp rise between the ages of 2 and 5 may indicate a period of physiological or dietary stress that preceded the change in diet, as this can also produce raised nitrogen values in body tissues, followed by a return to a normal state after the age of 6. But this aspect needs further investigation. To put these results into context with other data from the same period and possible places of origin, in the figure above it can be seen that in early life, the female from Ketilsstaðir had a diet similar to that found from a female Viking burial in Westernist Orkney, along with the majority of the people of Britain and Ireland prior to the increase in sea fishing in the Viking period. Then, after the age of 5, her diet changed as she consumed more marine protein and shifted towards that found in 2 male Viking burials at Westerness. All 3 of these Westerness Viking burials were not indigenous to the Orkney Isles, but the 2 men had a different origin to the female, which may explain the difference in diet. This figure depicts the values of the terrestrial and marine diets, and the red triangles plot the progressive changes from a terrestrial to marine diet. Michèle will discuss this further later, so I will leave that to her. Strontium and oxygen isotopes were obtained from the tooth enamel of the right second maxillary incisor, which completes its mineralization around the age of 5. The data there provided information about a place of residence in early childhood if food and water was sourced locally. If food was transported from Orkney, for example, then the assumption will not hold and people may appear to be immigrants, when in fact it was the food that moved to the people. As is shown in the figure above, the combined strontium and oxygen isotope results demonstrate that the burial from Ketilsstaðir does not fall within the range that would be expected for inhabitants of Iceland and the Faroes, indicated by the purple square. Because her strontium isotope ratio is too high to be consistent with origins on basalts, which would require a value below 0.7092. Instead, the burial from Ketilsstaðir plots within the range of values obtained for inhabitants of the Western and Northern Isles of Britain. The combination of a ratio between seawater at 0.7092 and 0.7110 and strontium concentration above 150 parts per million, as obtained from the individual from Ketilsstaðir, is rarely seen in archaeological populations from Britain, apart from the coastal and island dwellers in such places as the Northern and Western Isles, where this combination is a key attribute of these island-dwelling populations as shown in this figure above. This observation is therefore in agreement with the oxygen isotope data and with the prevailing diet in these locations, where the evidence suggests they were not consuming significant amounts of marine protein prior to the Viking period. Viking burials from mainland Scandinavia tend to have very low lead levels because the anthropogenic exposure to lead was minimal at this time. While this was not necessarily the case in the British Isles, particularly during and after the Roman period. The lead isotopes in the enamel match lead ore sources from English lead mines of Carboniferous age. For example, the Pennines and Mendips, and other archaeological humans excavated in England and dating to the 1st and 2nd millennium AD. This is not proof that she was from England, as such ratios may be found elsewhere in the world in humans who were exposed to lead, either imported from England or from other sources of comparable age, and natural variation in humans from unpolluted regions outside the Roman Empire has not yet been fully characterized. The result is also not consistent with lead from regions of older geology such as mainland Scotland, Norway or Sweden, or younger geology such as Iceland, and the lead result is consistent with all other isotopes which rule out an Icelandic origin. More accurate and direct information will hopefully be available in the future as Scandinavian isotopic concentrations for various isotopes such as lead are published. While it is not possible with isotope analysis to say with any certainty where the female buried at Ketilsstaðir lived before the age of 5, she clearly did not come from a cold northern climate such as Iceland, Greenland, Norway, Sweden, or northern and central Europe, or indeed eastern mainland Britain or Ireland. She falls within the range of dietary and residential isotopic values that were characteristic of the northern and western Isles, and western and southern Britain and Ireland, and even parts of Denmark. The strontium concentration data suggests a coastal or island origin. I'm not going to talk too much about the AMS dating because, again, Michèle will be going into this in much more detail. But this sample was based on the same collagen that was taken for the isotopic analysis for migration and diet, and indicated that the collagen was formed sometime with 89% probability that it formed sometime between 765 and 900. I will now present a summary of the ongoing ancient DNA research as summarized by Lísa Rúnarsdóttir from Decode Genetics. Ancient DNA from human remains provides an effective means to study biodiversity, migration, environments, and human health in past populations. And previous and ongoing ADNA studies at Decode have mapped the migration of people to Iceland, indicating that approximately 66% of male settlers were of Scandinavian descent and approximately 60% were of female settlers were of Celtic descent. The vial on the right contains some of the collagen, approximately 11 milligrams, extracted from the tooth for isotopic analysis. As we discovered in this process, collagen that is extracted with isotopic analysis cannot really be used in DNA because of the chemicals that are used in this process to destroy the remaining DNA. And likewise, 50 milligrams is often stated as the minimum for ADNA extraction, so we weren't even optimistic we would get something from this in the first place. But on the left is a small bone sample, which is 54 milligrams in weight. It was cut in a sterilized fume cupboard using a Dremel with a rotary blade, which was immediately contained in a biological sample container. It was cut from the petrous portion of the temporal bone, which is located on the side of the skull. The site was chosen for sampling because it was in good preservation, it was complete, and as a skeletal element, it has been identified to be the most useful sampling site for obtaining ADNA from human remains other than teeth. After the samples were cut, decontaminated, and digested, the extractions were performed in a dedicated ADNA lab in a facility where no PCR amplification of DNA is performed. DNA libraries were then constructed and measured on bioanalyzer to estimate the size, fraction, and quantity of DNA. The two libraries from the petrous bone showed a low quantity of ADNA, while the library from the tooth has no ADNA and was thereby excluded from further analysis. MySeq shotgun screening assessed the quality of the bone samples and determined that ancient DNA from the individual from Ketilsstaðir remains in the sample, confirming that she was in fact a woman. The next step in this ongoing research is to perform whole genome enrichment, followed by more extensive sequencing on HiSeq. It was the aim of this research to employ modern analytical methods that were not available in the past, despite the progressive insight that Matthias had at the time about the discovery and its research potential. Our findings illustrate some of the migratory and cultural complexities that were occurring during this time period around the settlement of Iceland. And I would like to thank all of these people for their contributions in this research.
Thank you, Joe, for this. We should have time for a couple of questions. Anyone?
Well, we don't know yet, because Sunna is working on so many other things, and as am I. It might take a little while, but hopefully by the end of the year. She did.
4.
Yes. Well, 3 of them. The other side of the maxilla was missing.
So if there are no more questions at this point, I would like to thank Joe. We're going to be taking a short break now. We're going to be offering you some refreshments up in the area next to the exhibition. I would like to ask you to use the back door to get up the stairs to where we're having coffee. I would like to ask you please not to bring the coffee back here and not to bring it into any other exhibition areas. We'll reconvene here starting again at 2 o'clock. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the publication that accompanies the exhibition, available in the museum shop. So we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. Tubman, Archaeological Conservator and former employee of the National Museum of Iceland, who carried out a conservation project that she's going to tell us more about. Julia, welcome. Hello everyone, can everyone hear me at this level? So I'm Julia Tubman and I was formerly the Conservator of the National Museum of Iceland for 18 months between February 2013 and August 2014. I'll be talking today about the conservation of the fluid preserved human remains from the Ketilsstaðir burial, which you can currently see in a jar in the exhibit, which I'm guessing you've all now seen. Now, I should explain that I am trained as an archaeological conservator, and whilst I have an interest in fluid-preserved specimens, conserving this kind of object is not actually my specialism, though I'd like to think that now I have a relatively good understanding of liquid-preserved organics like this. I first encountered the cheek when I started at the museum during my introductory tour, when Brynja, who was then in charge of the archaeological storage, showed me the jar and asked me what could be done about it. I was instantly intrigued. Both my parents are nurses, so I'm not put off by bits of bodies or anything fairly gruesome. I have previously written a thesis about biological specimens in museum collections as well, so I had a very slight understanding of the matter. Just to start, I think we need to have a short explanation about why we have this preservation of the facial tissue. Human tissue rarely preserves in the archaeological context, and by the archaeological context I mean the burial environment of soil. And this is because bacteria and microorganisms, as well as an acidic or an alkaline soil, work to break down organic material like such things as facial tissue, any kind of leather or stuff like that. Usually we recover bone at most, except for what you might call an extreme environment, so you probably know all about mummies or Iceland or such. In this instance of the face, the copper alloy brooches positioned close to the woman's face actually prevented the breakdown of the tissue because copper works as what we call a biocide, inhibiting bacterial action. The copper also prevented the decomposition of the textiles that Michèle will be speaking about later. Starting the project, I was able to make an initial assessment of the jar and its contents, and began to think about the problems facing the continued preservation of the human tissue. If you look at these 3 photographs of the face at the beginning of the project, I think a lot of you will probably be able to guess what some of the problems are. The human tissue was originally fixed and preserved in formaldehyde in 1938, which is a considerably long time ago now. And since that time, the formaldehyde, which is kind of the greenish liquid you can see at the bottom of the jar, has actually evaporated. It might have been knocked over at one point as well, but I think actually just over time a lot of it has evaporated. The lid on the jar doesn't form a very good seal at all. So without our interventions, the formaldehyde would have continued to evaporate and the cheek would have dried out. Whilst that might sound like a good thing, the cheek drying out, it would mean that we could take the cheek out of the jar and have a good look at it. It would actually have resulted in a lot of damage to the tissue.
it would have become shrunken and it would become very distorted. The evaporating formaldehyde also presents a risk to museum staff, as formaldehyde is actually a carcinogen, so we don't really want it near anybody. So people just walking by it on a day-to-day basis, handling in the lab, there are risks associated with this material. So you can also see a bluish wire. If you look at the top of the jar, and it's what that was, it was wrapped around the jaw bones and actually went through some of the tissue. And the purpose of this was to suspend the face within the jar when they originally fixed and preserved it. Unfortunately, as formaldehyde ages, it does become extremely acidic, and it had corroded the wire completely. The wire broke, and it also, the wire itself had stained human remains in places. You can see that on the bones when I show you some detailed shots later. This acidity is also bad news for the facial tissue itself, as it would have come to have a hugely detrimental effect on the bones and the teeth in the jar. You can also see some white, kind of fluffy material that you can see in the second shot just there. This is cotton wool, actually, which is not a good material for conservation and shouldn't be used in liquid preserved specimens. But I think what they did was just put it underneath the jaw and to hold up the tissue so it was nice and faced up. Okay, so here are some rather gruesome detailed shots. Just a bit of warning. So this is all before I started working on the jar properly. This is just thinking about the problems, thinking about how we can address the preservation issues. This photograph is actually of the front of the face, and this is the wire that I was talking about earlier. You can see that it's corroded all the way through. And you can see some of the staining left on the bone, just this bit underneath the teeth. I will say at this stage that the teeth look like they're in a pretty good condition, but this is actually a bit of a ruse, and I'll explain that in a second. They're not as in a good condition as they look like they are. So this second photograph is so you can all have a good look at what the facial tissue looked like before we started the conservation project. You can see that luckily the tissue looks like it's still quite wet and gooey, I guess. This gave me hope that resubmerging the face in liquid would be a good way to go, and that the facial tissue hadn't dried out too much in the jar. I think Joe showed this photograph, but here it is a bit more close up. So see, this is some of the loose teeth that were lying at the bottom of the jar. This is a fragment of the maxilla. I doubt when they originally put the face in the jar they meant for this to be just sort of like waving around at the bottom loose. I think it was probably propped up on the cotton wool that's also shifted around in the jar. And you can see that the bone looks kind of damaged, and you can see bits of ephemera coming off it. It could be that this damage was caused to the bone, and sorry, I just skipped it. The damage was caused to the bone by the formaldehyde. We don't actually know the condition of the bones when they went into the jar, but it also looks to be a bit of sort of burial detritus attached to the bone itself. And you can see here what I mean when I say that the teeth look to be in a good condition, but actually they're not. Copper ions from the corroding copper from the woman's brooches, and probably also from the corroding wire that was attached to the face in 1938, have stained the dentine beneath the enamel layer. So the enamel layer is the white section, and we're looking at that green bit in the middle of the tooth. The bone around the teeth looks fragile here as well. And the rest of the woman's bones that we have are poorly preserved. Their soil conditions in the grave were not favourable. So those are the bits of bone that Joe showed you earlier. I think you can probably tell that they didn't look that great. So this is the beginning of kind of the practical aspects of the project. We're talking about refixing the tissue. After I made the initial conservation assessment and I read up on the spirit preserved specimens, I contacted Málþing, who is the Conservator of the Royal College of Surgeons in London. The Royal College of Surgeons has a very old collection of human remains preserved in formaldehyde in their Ontario Museum. This is a fantastic museum for anyone visiting London. It holds some very, very old specimens used for medical training, as well as a few oddities like two-headed lizards and things like that, if you ever happen to be in that area. Considering the extreme age of this face, I wanted to talk to a specialist who also dealt with older specimens, though even the Hunterian doesn't actually have anything as old as the Ketilsstaðir woman. And they don't have anything from an archaeological context either, but it was still the best way to seek advice. I contacted Málþing as I had very specific questions about how to treat the face. I knew that I needed to refix the tissue before putting it into the final solution. This would wet the tissue and repeats the original process the tissue went through in 1938. Fixing the tissue prevents the breakdown of the human proteins into amino acids by forming chemical bonds and coagulates the tissue so it becomes insoluble. To refix the face, I first removed the old formaldehyde solution using pipette. So that's what you see on this photograph on this slide. The photograph on the right shows the condition of the human remains in the jar without the old formaldehyde in it. So you can look at, it looks all a bit dirty and you can see all the wire and there's a cotton wool. So this is taking out the old formaldehyde. The fixation, this is after I put in a fresh formaldehyde solution to fix the tissue. The fixation process takes around 10 days. I left it a little bit longer, which didn't cause the cheek any harm, because I was waiting for the chemicals and such to arrive to Iceland. After refixing, I debated about what long-term preservative to hold the face in. The preservative is generally, for human samples, a different solution to the fixative solution. I could keep the face in another solution of formaldehyde, which isn't a good idea, but eventually the fluid would discolour and become acidic. You can see the discoloration over the period of about a week in that photograph. And if I kept with formaldehyde, it would need changing within about 2 or 3 years. Eventually, before the formaldehyde is a danger to people, so I really didn't want to keep the face in it at all. What with people walking past the jar and handling it for study and research. For human specimens, a lot of conservators now are transferring their formaldehyde-preserved specimens to a solution known as Icelandic 3. This is a far more stable solution. This is a glycerin and water-based liquid that has a neutral pH and for a number of years is relatively stable and inert. So it's quite a popular choice when it comes to this sort of material. Unfortunately though, most recipes call for a small amount of formaldehyde to be included, which was an element that again I wasn't too keen on. I don't want formaldehyde in the lab, I don't want people walking past it, I don't want to use it myself. And even with the Kaiserling solution, over time the solution can become acidic and look cloudy, which if you're trying to view the specimen is not something you want. This would mean that sometime, say in the next 10 years, someone would have to change the fluid. This was another problem. Considering that there really aren't that many conservators with a specialism in fluid-preserved specimens, and there might not be anyone even willing to change the fluid in the future, this kind of work with human remains doesn't do it for everyone. I took the advice of Martin Cook and chose to use a light liquid paraffin as the long-term preservative solution. Liquid paraffin doesn't get used often for preserving human specimens, but it has some really great properties. It's absolutely inert, meaning it won't react with anything in the jar, it won't become acidic over time, and after an initial settling in process, the fluid will not become discoloured. There are human specimens actually in the Hunterian collection that have been in paraffin for 30 years with absolutely no change to the solution. So that's great for the National Museum. We can put it in the jar and we can just check it every now and again, but we won't have to do any work on it. Paraffin isn't dangerous to human beings at all, so that made it a very attractive prospect for long-term storage. Now, because when you're doing conservation work, you've usually got your hands dirty, you're covered in chemicals, you can't really take any photographs. So Joe worked with me when we put the face in a new jar with paraffin and we set up a camera just to record our work and for prosperity, because we had an idea that we might do a bit of an exhibition about it. So what I'm going to do is show the video and kind of walk you through what's happening at each stage. It's heavily edited. I think it was about an hour long when we did the job itself. I might pause it every now and again just to go over something. Okay, so this reverts back to that photograph I just showed you. This is the refixing process. This is a fresh formaldehyde. And the first stage is I am actually using a pipette to slowly remove the fluid. I didn't want to cause any big waves or anything. I didn't want to move the tissue too much. So this was a really long process. It took forever. Okay. And just here, after I'd taken out all the formaldehyde from the refixing process, my next job, which was quite frightening, was to break the glass. When I asked my cook in the Royal College of Surgeons how he broke glass jars to get specimens out, he said that he put the jar in a bucket and then hit it with a hammer. And I think that is the highlight of his days, most days. But I wasn't keen on this idea, and I guess maybe I'm a bit of a wimp. But I got a load of jam jars and coffee jars, and I practiced for ages doing this. What I did was I used a diamond drill bit. So what I'm doing here is just wrapping tape around the glass so I can guide myself and just hold the glass steady while I'm holding the drill. So I'm going to cut it just now. It's me holding. You can't see too much, but my hands are shaking quite badly at this point. So this is using a diamond drill bit on a Dremel drill, and we just went around a few times. I've also put paper inside the jar to try and protect the face from any glass splinters. I used a little tiny hammer to sort of gently encourage the jar to break. Put on some special gloves so I don't hurt myself. And it came off, I don't think it came off too badly. It worked fairly well. The jam jars experiments went much worse than that, so that was a good one. There was a little bit of clean-up work to do once we'd taken the face out of the jar. There were a few glass splinters that had made it onto the tissue, and just some general dust and dirt. So here I'm just using actually water on a cotton wool bud just to gently pick it off. Just cleaning it. You can see the wires still attached there. Just to point out, I did remove most of the wire where I could because I didn't want it attached to the face. It's not aesthetically pleasing, it serves no purpose at this stage. So I used some wire cutters just to pull it off. I think there's still a teeny weeny bit left in the facial tissue. That was where it pierced the tissue, and it would cause way more damage pulling it out than if I just left it in there. So at this stage, I've just put the face in a brand new jar. This is a bespoke jar that we ordered from England. I like this jar because you may notice with the old jar it's quite narrow at the neck, so I could only get one arm in there, and I didn't want to lift the face with one hand. So the new jar is wide enough that we could put two hands in there and safely lift it. We've just put it in there, put the face in there now. Positioning the tissue is quite difficult because it sort of floats around, to be honest. And then we carefully and slowly fill the jar with paraffin in tiny beakers, bit by bit. You can't see Joe, sorry, but he was there for every step of this. So we filled it right up to the top. You can see how much paraffin I have in my hands, and it's quite slippery, obviously. And this is kind of a before and after shot. So this is before conservation and after conservation. I will explain. There was quite a nervous period after we put it in the paraffin because there was a certain amount of water inside the tissue itself that left the tissue and into the paraffin. Paraffin and water are not miscible solutions, so the paraffin became cloudy. Martin Cook had assured me that this would resolve itself, but I think it took about 2.5 months, and we're getting closer and closer to the time we exhibit. But then it all just dissipated. Everything was fine. That's the end of that. And if I just put up my acknowledgements quickly. This is just a few people that I really like. Martin Cook, obviously, for all his advice, and Natalie, my boss, for not only supporting me for the project, but having to live with the face in the fume cupboard, which happened to be in her office at the time. So, thank you, Natalie, for that. Any questions?
Yeah, because you said that, I was wondering, because the paraffin is really a great material, as you said. I was wondering why it's not more used.
To be honest, I think it's just happened that no one's actually written anything about using paraffin. I think perhaps a couple of Osteologists across the world have experimented with it. I think the only reason that Málþing knew how to use it was because he was curious about its properties one day and just tried it out as an experiment. But one of the next thing we might do is write a paper about it to try and get the information out there that it's a nice, stable, long-term preservative solution for human specimens. So.
Any more questions?
The fact that the cheese is preserved like that and has been preserved all this time, does that mean there will never be a time when it will be possible to take tiny sample and do DNA analysis or anything? Or is that something that might happen in the future?
It's certainly something that could happen in the future. This is another favourable access aspect of the paraffin in that it's inert and it doesn't really bond with the tissue. So it's not really penetrated it too much. So we could in the future remove it from the paraffin. And if we could remove, say, the copper salts and the remains of the formaldehyde, it might be possible to do some kind of analysis. I know that they've done experiments with teeth. Maybe Joby able to answer this question.
There is one recent method that addresses the contamination of formalin and copper, but it hasn't been used very much, and the preservation is so poor anyway that we didn't feel confident that trying this would give us much of a result. But maybe once the method has been further tested and has come up with some really useful results and or some good results, then maybe it will be possible in the future.
Because before we found another tooth in the box for the ADNA and the isotope analysis, we thought we might have to use one of the ones in the jar. So we did look into it, but it's quite a time-consuming process to sort all the organic components out.
Well, thank you, Julia. Last to speak here today is Michèle Smith, who is Research Associate at the Heffenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University. Her focus is more on material culture and textiles, so she's going to reveal the fascinating results of her research.
Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming here today on such a beautiful day, and staying inside rather than being outdoors. So, as Annalisa explained, I'm actually specialized I'm an archaeologist by training. Most of my work has been on dress. It's one thing that I'm very interested in, dress and adornment. I did my doctoral work on jewellery, actually, on Icelandic jewellery from these burials. And more recently have been working on textiles. So I thought I would start out with, first of all, just to look at these oval brooches, which are largely responsible for the degree of preservation that we have actually on this site. And as Julia mentioned, it is basically the corrosion and the metal ions that come out of the copper that helped in its preservation, because it creates an environment that is inhospitable, if you want, for bacteria to attack and disintegrate organic materials. So obviously things like flesh, and for me, the textiles, which we do have some remains. I also wanted to use this slide to start talking also about clothing. What do we know about Scandinavian clothing of the Viking Age? Of course, a lot of this material comes out of burial work, largely in Scandinavia itself. The data is sometimes a little bit confusing because, of course, when it comes to textiles, textiles don't preserve very well, so they preserve if they've been in contact with metals or if they're in particular sort of contexts. So there's often just little fragments, and so things have been pieced together over many, many years of research, largely from sites like Birka, Hedvig, places like that. But we do know that Scandinavian women wore a long garment, and you can see it at the far end over there, like a kind of a chemise or long shirt. It was often made out of linen, thought to be pleated sometimes, long sleeves and closed at the neck. They had no buttons at the time, so it would have been tied with a brooch. And this could also be out of wool, but linen was very, very common in Scandinavia. On top of that, they would wear this sort of apron that you can see actually in the slide here, or a pinafore apron, also called smokke. And here too, there's a lot of kind of disagreement with exactly how this thing was made. So there's one theory that it was made of two separate individual panels of cloth, one in front, one in the back with open sides. There's another theory that it was made as a tube. There's another theory that it was pleated, as you can see there. And another theory is that there was a panel of cloth that was worn in the front and wrapped around one side to the back and another one on the other side, so that you're sort of in an envelope, and this was held together with the brooches. Another less popular theory was that in fact it's just one piece of cloth that is just sort of wrapped around at the front, and that there's all these embellishments on the garments underneath. You do see that there are generally embellishments at the top of these aprons, and often at the bottom of them as well, which were done through tablet weaving. So they would hang, of course, things from the oval brooches that you see here, keys, beads, various things, scissors, etc. And then we have the oval brooches that are located sort of at breast level that you can see. They are probably the ultimate and most quintessential piece of Viking female adornment. Often used when there are no skeletal remains and they find these in burials, they agree that these are female graves, which sometimes can be misleading, but anyways, definitely a gendered object. Their designs are equally standardized, so you will find these brooches, they're always worn in pairs. The pairs are always identical. In fact, most times they come out of the same mold as well. So they're identical in every possible aspect. The designs themselves also go through a series of evolutionary stages, which I'll show you in a bit. They are, like I said, widespread across the Viking world. You will find them everywhere. You find them in Russia, you find them in Scandinavia, you find them in Iceland, you find them across the British Isles as well. They are probably the production of, they come out of these trade centers in Scandinavia where they are, it's a form of, if you want, a limited mass production or in these sort of pre-urban environments. I just wanted to show you also them close up, and you can see that their designs are, that they generally have these associations, several bosses on them, which are also not completely random. There are usually about 9 bosses, and 9 is a very important number in pre-Christian pagan religion, Norse religion. Their location on the body also makes me, to me, they look a little bit like a pair of stylized breasts, almost like they're trying to emphasize ideas about femininity, about possibly fertility, associations possibly with some of the goddesses of that period. I'm thinking of Freya. They're definitely in use during the pre-Christian period, and they eventually die out of use by the conversion of Christianity. So they seem to be definitely tied into that whole sort of idea. Now, these are some of the, we did a whole series of diagrams while we were working on this project, and these are some of the first, this one here is one of the first sketches that we did on it. We decided to go with the idea that she possibly had the tubular type of apron, though of course we don't know 100% because there's not enough textile remaining to tell us if it was a tubular type, but it seems to be the general consensus at the moment. And you can see the location of her brooches. I put the other one on the other side. This is a diagram that came out of Neil Price's book on called The Viking Way. It was done by an Icelandic artist as well, and he has a depiction you can see here of the panel type, of the 2 panels open in the front and in the back. So one, here's the apron, and then the other half on the other side. It's another possibility for variation on the theme. So another interesting thing about these brooches is that they tend to be found in the burials in Scandinavia, largely of women who have arrived at a certain point in their life. So they're not found in the graves of very, very young women, which makes me also think that they might be associated with marriage or having been married, maybe a little bit with a wedding ring, like you would wear a wedding ring today, or associated with women who have a certain standing, and possibly women who have had children as well, given this kind of symbolic association that they have. When it comes to the sequence of these have been studied by an archaeologist called Jan Pedersen in the early 20th century, who tried to sort of put some order into Viking material culture at the time and organize them into various typologies. And so today, when we refer to some of these objects, we often refer to them as a P and then a number, P for Pedersen, and then a number. So our brooch is the one in the middle here, right here. And this brooch is a Pedersen 52 variety. You can see in this, I tried to put the sequence of evolution because they've been studied also subsequently by another archaeologist called Ingmar Jansson. And he actually looked at them, actually mostly this one, the bottom, the P51s, in a sequence, and noted, in fact, that there were families and subfamilies of these. So they seem to have emerged sort of one out of the other, the designs changing, but becoming very, very standardized and produced in a mass way. So they start out in the 8th century with these, what they call Berdal-style brooches, which are single-shelled. This one in the middle, the 9th century, this one has supposedly Osberg designs on them. This one is from Iceland, again, a single shell. And eventually, by the late 9th century, they become double-shelled, which means they have a base shell and another one on top, which is then riveted to the top, giving it that kind of lace-like work. This one here, the P51, is by far the most common of them. These ones are everywhere, like all over the place. And they're, like I said, there's different families of them, suggesting that designs on them emerged one out of the other, possibly through casting. Now, our brooch here, the P52, is considered by Pedersen to be late in the sequence. Now, Pedersen did his dating, this was done early 20th century. He didn't have carbon-14 dating. So what he did is he used associated coin finds and tried to put them in some kind of sequence. Well, it turns out that his sequence is wrong, which is not surprising. And when we dated Our Lady, we found her to be, in fact, older than the brooches she was wearing, which didn't make any sense. I wrote to Neil Price about this, who's been working on burials, and I said, have you encountered this before? And he said, yes, this is quite common. You know, obviously these typologies need to be revised. So I'm putting the P52 brooch at a larger sort of late 9th century to late 10th. It's kind of a time span, so it would fit with the dating that we got back from the lady from Ketilsstaðir. As you can see, as they get more and move more and more towards 1000 AD, they become also to sort of deteriorate in shape. They become more and more elaborate, more and more gaudy. This one here, these are bosses. By this point, these are horse heads on them. And in the end, like any fashion, anybody who studies fashion will see that, you know, fashions go through these peaks, and by the time they start going out of fashion, things start to become really crappy. They become mass-produced, and they become, you know, kind of cheap, and nobody really wants to wear them anymore. Well, the same with the oval brooches, and the one in the last sequence, you know, they really look kind of ugly, and their designs are not as careful. And after that, that's it. That's the end of it. Now, she had also a trefoil brooch, which was worn here, probably closing the long dress that she had. And this one has been classified again by Pedersen typology as P91. What's interesting about this motif, or this type of brooch, is this type of brooch came from the Frankish kingdom, originally, the shape, and they were generally decorated with acanthus leaves. The fact that this one has acanthus leaves suggests two things. One is that it is Viking loot that they brought over and she was wearing it, or else it could have been made in Scandinavia, replicating Frankish motifs on it. But generally what the Norse did is they took these brooches and then they added their own animal art onto them, and so you get sort of a hybrid form. By the time you get to the British Isles, they continued this, and they took the same shape of the brooch, but then they added Celtic designs, of which there are two in Iceland here. This one from Hafbjarnarstaðir, which there's, like I said, there's two of these with a different type of motif, but still the same shape of brooch. And the other one like this is actually in Shetland. So there are three of these. All right, let's move on to the textiles now to find out more about what she was wearing. So I just put this box. This is not the only box there were. There were several boxes, and they were all sort of all over the place. So the idea was trying to make sense out of all these textiles. What do we have? Of course, there's going to be multiple pieces that are part of the same piece of cloth. So my idea was to try and focus out and figure out how many actual pieces of cloth do we have and where do they fit in the context of her garments and what are they telling us about clothing. And they actually do fit into the Norse clothing styles very much. So now I analyzed these before there was any talk of the exhibit as part of a textile project that I'm working on. And then I went back and reanalyzed them about 3 times again for the exhibit, and we'll probably do it once I've not stared at them for so much and see if I see anything else in there because things can keep coming to you as you keep going. So basically, like I said, I was able to identify 4 types of cloth. Now there was this piece here that I found. There were several pieces also that were sort of clumps of, I'm not sure exactly what they were, probably body fluids and corrosion products. I remember I showed one to Joe, and he said, no, there's no bone in here, there's nothing, it's just basically, hardened body fluid, and no textiles really. So we had to discard, obviously, some of these as well. But in this particular piece, I was struck actually because there were actually 2 types of cloth that I could find. On one hand, there was this one here, which was a twill weave, a 2-to-2 twill, and then there was a patch here where there was a considerable amount of corrosion. And when I looked at it under the microscope, I found that it was actually a very different type of weave, a plain weave, which is the simplest of weave. I think it's called einskipt in Icelandic, over 1, under 1, very simple. So those 2, right there were 2 different pieces of cloth. So what I did is that for the piece on the corrosion, it's quite like I said, quite corroded. I was able to sample some of it. I also found the same kind of cloth stuck inside the brooches. I've got several slides of these, but some of them are more visible than others. I don't know if you can see here, there's different weaves, but there's some very, very fine weave here, the tabby weave. This is the same thing that I found on the others. So I had to find a piece that wasn't too corroded, that they were going to be able to analyze something out of it. Here again, we have the same thing again, and you have a close-up of what that actually looks like. And I was able to sample these, and I sent them to a lab in Chicago called McCrum's Associate, and they subjected them to 2 types of analyses. The PLM analyses and FTIR, which the first one is polarizing light microscopy, where you project, in fact, through the fibers, and you're able to see the scales. These are not from Ketilsstaðir, these are just examples, just to show you the method. And they were actually able to identify out of our sample up here, this is the first sample right here, that this was in fact linen. Now linen is probably the worst of all for preservation. Wool is pretty good, but linen is terrible. In fact, linen only preserves if it's burnt or if you find, in fact I've seen it like that, or if you find it in mineralized context like this. So we couldn't do a lot with it because it was a very tiny, tiny sample, but we were still able to find out it was linen. So this is most likely part of the underdress, the long dress underneath her robes that I showed you at the beginning. Just to give you an idea, I think I should have shown you this a little earlier on, but basically there are 2 types of weave, or main weaves. The plain weave, like I said, is like over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1. Also just to show you, when we talk about the vertical yarns in weaving, we're talking about warp yarns. These are the vertical threads. The horizontal ones are called the weft. And the other part of the textile was in a 2-to-2 twill, or a twill. If you have a tweed jacket, you have a twill. It's also, vavmal is made like that as well. So back to our textile pieces. So here I have these corrosion products which we identified were linen from her undergarment, and then there was this bit here, the 2-to-2 twill, the vavmal piece. And I wondered, I looked at this, and there was another piece of it as well. Like I said, there's often more than one example of it. And here you have sort of a close-up of it. And this piece was really cool because not only did I have the same 2-to-2 twill, it was quite dark, but I also had another band here, which is a tablet woven band. So this is my third piece of cloth. Now these are often the decorative bands that you find at the top of the aprons. And this is what made me think that in fact the other twill that we saw on the other slide, on this one right here, was in fact part of her apron because it's the same cloth as this one right here, these pieces here. Woven in the same way, same thread count, spun the same way. Now I'll talk a bit more about the tablet woven band later, but let's get to the first one, the apron. So I think that what we're seeing here is in fact the apron that was worn on top of her linen dress. And the interesting thing about this piece, and actually the linen piece, is that, remember the warp threads I mentioned are the vertical ones and the webbed ones are the horizontal ones. When you're spinning and you're making textiles, you have the option to spin in two ways. You can either spin clockwise, and then we refer to this as Z spun, or you can go counterclockwise, and we say this is S spun. When you weave textiles, you can either weave ZZ, ZS, or SS, whatever you want. You have that option. Generally, why people decide to do this, one or the other, has more to do with what they learned as children. So it's kind of, it can be used almost as a cultural marker because these things don't change a lot over time. So her apron, the twill, was spun Z to Z. Z in the warp, Z in the weft. Her undergarment, the linen undergarment, was Z in the warp, Z in the weft as well, which was really interesting. Now what that tells me right away is that this is a textile tradition that comes from Norway. Now, across Scandinavia in the 2nd century when people acquired the work-weighted loom, everything was spun Z to Z. And they were spun, they were weaving two twills with this. By the Viking Age, for some reason, the rest of Scandinavia switches to Z in the warp, S in the weft, but Norway and Gotland continue spinning Z to Z. And they bring this with them to the British Isles. In the Norse settlements, and then they bring them to Iceland as well. So you find this in Viking burials in the British Isles. The rest of the UK, they're spinning Z to S as they are in the rest of Europe. But because you do have people from the British Isles who are also spinning Z to S, you find in the Viking Age in Iceland the two side by side, which is exactly what happened in this burial, suggesting in fact two textile traditions going on at once, which is kind of interesting. So basically, like I said, the apron and the undergarment were spun in this Norwegian textile tradition. I'm just going to move on. Oh, sorry. Let me just talk briefly about the tablet woven band. Textiles are complicated because you're sort of jumping from piece to piece, and they're all tied together. Now, this tablet woven band is done using another technique. It's not on the loom, but it's used with cards. So it's a card weaving process. And this thing was integrated into the weave, so it wasn't something that was sewn on or added on at all. And basically what this is telling us is that that this was done directly on the warp-weighted loom. In the Faroe Islands, in Iceland and Greenland, they tend to start, in fact, when they started their weaving at the top, they would start with the tablet woven band and then weave subsequently from there. So what that tells us is that this was actually integrated as part of it. So another piece that we found was this piece here. And this one, interestingly, was woven a lot like Icelandic vatnam, with this one Z in the warp, S in the weft. So this is a different tradition, and this is much more like continental Europe, more what you would find in the British settlements of the British Isles. So you basically, like I said, you have two textile traditions going on at once. Another thing we did was test for dyes, and I'm going to go through this quickly because I think we're running out of time. I have a little bit more to talk about with the dates and whatnot, but I submitted the two samples, of course, because that's what I had the most of the strap, because I think I forgot to mention this, but this piece here, which caused me a little bit of trouble, had an imprint of the brooch on it, right here. And for the longest time, I thought actually this was part of a cloak. And then I looked at the shape, and I looked at it was much coarser, and I came to the conclusion this was probably part of the straps of the apron, so holding it together. that were then often looped through a loop in the back, a loop in the front, and then tied underneath in the brooch, which is why you get all the fibers inside of the brooch. And so this is the strap. So we had enough to sample for this one, enough to sample from the apron, submitted them for dye testing at the University of Rhode Island. They have a department of textiles. And a grad student there tested them first for indigo, and both of them came back blue, which is where she got the name of the lady in blue, from her blue garments. Now, generally what was used for this would have been a plant called woad, and woad grows across Northern Europe and Scandinavia. Apparently not so much here, so this was probably something that they may have imported and used it here. And it's extremely common actually in the burials in Scandinavia. What is not entirely clear is whether or not this is only a color found in burials or used for death, or whether it was also worn during life. That is not clear. The same with the oval brooches. We're not entirely sure if they were something that was only put in the grave for death or also worn in everyday life. So just to re-summarize the color again, so we didn't have enough to test for color on this one. This is the blue apron, this is the blue woolen strap, and this is a tablet woven brand, which did not test positive for indigo. It was brown and white. So there would have been kind of an interesting sort of color arrangement. Just to show you the percentage of indigo in Viking burials in Iceland, you can see even here it's quite common. 65% of the textiles that I've tested for, or had tested for indigo, came back positive, as opposed to 31. So definitely a color associated more so with women, which is also the case in Scandinavian burials as well. Summary of her textiles: linen undergarment made in a plain weave, Z to Z spun. A blue apron over the top, which was woven in a 2-2 twill, also Z to Z spun with the cream-colored tablet woven band at the top as a starting border. Linen and apron are made according to Norwegian textile traditions in the use of Z to Z spun yarns. The strap is a 2-2 twill. It's woven more according to British or continental weaving traditions in that it's Z to S. It was also dyed blue. It's also very similar in construction to the vadmal that you find later on during the medieval period that becomes a form of currency, the strap, that is. Now, with this having been done, I then sent the two samples, again, of the apron and the strap to Copenhagen and had them tested for strontium analysis by Karen Frey, who has been doing most of, in fact, I think she's the only person in the world who does this kind of analysis on strontium. And both of the textiles came back, showed signatures that fall into the range of the Icelandic baseline range. So the textiles were made in Iceland using these techniques, these two techniques, which is actually really interesting in terms of the cultural identity of this person and what she was bringing, in fact, with her. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are the dates, and this was done by Kevin Smith at Brown University. And he did all the calibrating for the dates. We sampled actually two for the textiles and the tooth. And I'm going to read his part because I think it's easier that way. He said that 2 samples from the woman's clothing and 1 from her tooth were sent to Beta Analytic laboratories in Miami for AMS radiocarbon dating, which is accelerated mass spectrometry dating. It's a very precise form of radiocarbon dating, and it's appropriate for textiles because it requires really tiny samples, so it doesn't destroy a lot. Wool is an excellent material for radiocarbon dating because it only grows for a single year before it is shed or plucked. However, it is important to realize that when you're dating cloth, we are dating not when she lived or died, okay? That's very important to remember, or when she was buried. What we are dating, it's telling us when the wool was gathered for her garments. On the other hand, dating the tooth obviously will give you more information about when she actually died. Now, we got some rather early dates, and here at the top you have the 2 textile fragments and the tooth, and you can see that they are pretty early. So we were concerned, of course, about the marine reservoir effect, which can affect your dates and how early they are. So he says it's not enough to measure the carbon when you to get the final dating. The basic dates received from the lab must be calibrated, okay, according to different environmental factors. So, for example, the wool, whose wool was used, may have been fed on seaweed as fodder or inland grasses, as both have different effects on the carbon ratios from which they are calculated. So marine animals and plants don't absorb carbon from the atmosphere, but from the ocean, which has a lot of fossil carbon floating around. So as a result, seaweed collected today off the rocks of Reykjavik would give you a radiocarbon age of about 250 to 400 years old, right off the bat, collected today, simply because it has absorbed ancient marine carbon rather than new carbon from the atmosphere. However, our results clearly indicate that the sheep whose wool was used for these garments ate an entirely terrestrial diet, uncontaminated with marine carbon. The same issues affect samples taken from human bones or teeth, which also need to be calibrated. According to isotopic studies reported from this grave, the women's diet shifted significantly from a primarily terrestrial protein diet to a combined marine and terrestrial diet between the age of 5 and 10 years old. The tooth we dated was formed when she was around 2 to 3 years old, and this was considered when calibrating the dates. To date the women's clothing, one sample was taken from her apron and another from the strap. The results of these analyses suggest that her clothes were made sometime between 765 and 895 AD. AMS dating of the woman's tooth implies that she was born before AD 900, suggesting that she came to Iceland as a child between 870 and 900. If she arrived as an infant towards the end of that period, she would have died near the end of the first quarter of the 10th century, between 915 and 925. So just to sum up, I just wanted to point out that in terms of the visual appearance of this individual, her identity was definitely what she was trying to project, or what they were trying to project, was that she was Norwegian in terms of her jewelry, her textiles, but there are some elements like her strap, which suggest that she was also bringing some textile traditions from somewhere else. So there's kind of an amalgamation of things going on, which I think is actually kind of interesting, but also not uncommon, I think, probably for Iceland in that period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michèle, for a very interesting talk. Time is kind of running out, but we'll take time for some questions. Yes?
I was wondering about wool. In later sources, we know in Iceland that they use crane bill, So these researchers, do they rule out that they would have used crane bill in the West?
From what I know, I think yes, but there hasn't been a lot of work. I know there's a woman in the West who's doing some work with plants, local plants, and trying dyes and whatnot. I seem to recall I discussed this with her, and I think she agreed that the blues at that period were imported globally. Yes?
Well, I was just wondering, do you know why they would have switched in most of Europe to the ZS speed instead of the ZZ?
It's not clear.
Okay.
Not clear at all. But I mean, when it does, these things don't change. One thing about textile traditions is they're very, very static. They stay the same. People pass on. You know, it's one of these crafts you pass on from father to son, mother to daughter in this case. And people, this is the way we do it. This is the way we make it, which is why they're great for using them as sort of cultural markers, because, and they've used this actually in the States. You have communities in the Southwest where people are only spinning Z to Z, and right next door their neighbors are S to S. And yet they do have contact with each other, so it kind of becomes almost sort of like, and there's been tests done on this as to, you know, is it better for weaving? Some person recently told me, oh, that's because it, you know, if you don't do Z to S and you do Z to Z, your textile's going to go all crooked, which clearly it doesn't. Because there's enough examples from the Viking Age showing that they do Z to Z. So it's not because of any sort of technological concern. Yes.
I was just wondering about terminology. You referred to the apron as a smock. We know from written sources that women would have worn kitted, which probably would be
like
different
right.
from man's kitted.
This might have been a little bit later too. Sources, yeah. So
I was just wondering, because in Icelandic at least, the smock would have been more appropriate to the linen undergarment. So I was wondering whether obviously we don't know, but I was wondering why you could we refer to the apron as kitted?
Right.
If that's totally different.
The term smock actually came out of the Scandinavian literature, which is what they're calling the apron. But I actually often just call it an apron, and I call the dress underneath like a chemise or just a dress, you know, which is what it is.
But it's a little bit confusing when the terminology
right.
is a little bit
But it's like that. It's like that when you're in a lot of actually textile stuff sometimes in dress as well. People use terms like dress or costume and all these different things.
Yeah.
Any further questions?
Yes.
I was wondering about what you call the starting border,
Yes.
which is made, you said, in a tablet woven technique.
Right.
Could it also be what they call, I think, a pipe edging, which is...
I think that's different. I think the piping is
pipe
more.
edging is a combination of fabric weaving and sewing. It's a band that you attach to the fabric
Right.
after it's been woven.
This is integrated into it.
This is integrated.
Yeah, I've done this before actually. It's really confusing because you're basically, what happens is your warp yarns in the loom, the vertical ones that are your cloth, become the weft in the tablet wood because you're kind of working sideways like this. So it's pretty complicated to do it, but you do this at the start and then you start weaving.
It
Yep.
is not. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming here today. Thanks, Michèle, for your presentation. I'd also like to thank the presenters here today for sharing this fascinating material with us. In her introductory paper, Steinunn mentioned the question, who was she? And now we can see from both the textile analysis, the material culture, and the information gathered from the bones that even though we can't say precisely who she was, we can know a little bit more about her. So we can go back and reflect on that. Just before you go, I'd like to remind you again about the book, but thanks a lot for today.